This aircraft is on final approach to the newly built international airport in Pokhara, Nepal. Passengers are enjoying the stunning views of Pokhara city, a perfectly good aircraft and clear skies above Pokhara. But inside the cockpit, something is going terribly wrong. The pilots realize there is no power coming from the engines. They attempt to increase thrust, but nothing happens. The senior captain immediately takes control of the aircraft. Inside the cabin, passengers remain completely unaware of the crisis unfolding just meters ahead of them. One passenger is even live streaming the view from his window seat when suddenly, the aircraft banks sharply to the left and begins diving towards the ground. This is the terrifying story of Yeti Airlines Flight 691, an accident that should never have happened. January 15, 2023. It was just past 10 am at Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal. 68 passengers began boarding a Yeti Airlines ATR 72-500 aircraft. The aircraft was 16 years old and in good working condition. They were headed to Pokhara, often called the capital of tourism for its breathtaking scenery, vibrant culture, and its role as a gateway to the Annapurna mountain range. The flight from Kathmandu to Pokhara typically takes around 27 minutes. Also on board were 2 cabin crew members and 2 pilots. This flight was being operated by 2 captains, 58-year-old senior captain Kamal Casey and 44-year-old captain Anju Khatiora. Captain Anju Khatiora, seated on the left, was the pilot flying, responsible for controlling the aircraft. Captain Kamal Casey, in the right seat, was the pilot monitoring, tasked with supervising the flight, handling radio communications, and reading checklists. Captain Kamal Casey was a highly experienced pilot with over 21,000 flying hours, more than 3,300 of which were on the ATR 72. Captain Anju Khatiora also had a solid background, with over 6,000 flying hours and 186 hours on the ATR 72. This wasn't a routine flight. Captain Khatiora was in the process of obtaining airport familiarization. The aircraft would be landing at the newly built Pokhara International Airport, which had only started operations 2 weeks earlier. Though the new airport was near the old one they had flown into many times, this approach would be different. Still, both pilots were likely familiar with the surrounding terrain. The weather in Pokhara was forecast to be mostly sunny with light winds, an ideal day for flying. Earlier that morning, the same flight crew had already flown this route twice. This was now their 3rd flight of the day. Pokhara International Airport has a single runway, runway 12 at one end and runway 30 at the other end. On their previous flight, the crew landed on runway 30, which is typically used for arrivals from Kathmandu. It allows for a straight-in approach with the best terrain clearance. Just after 10:30 am local time, Flight 691 begins its takeoff roll. The takeoff, climb, cruise, and descent all go smoothly. As expected, air traffic control assigns runway 30 for landing, but without giving a reason, the crew requests a change to runway 12 instead. This was likely part of Captain Kamal Casey's plan to help Captain Khatiora practice approaches from both directions. It was a decision that would soon have devastating consequences. ATC approves the request. It's worth noting that this would be Captain Kamal Casey's 3rd time landing on runway 12 and Captain Khatiora's 1st. They were using a visual approach, meaning they weren't relying on instruments to guide the descent. Pokhara International Airport is surrounded by hills and valleys, making certain approaches especially tricky. Landing on runway 12 requires a tighter circuit due to the surrounding terrain. In fact, this approach did not meet stabilized approach criteria. It left the aircraft lower than minimum safe height when lined up with the runway. The aircraft descended into the downwind leg for runway 12. ATC visually identified the plane. The crew extended the flaps to 15 degrees and lowered the landing gear. Everything appeared normal. At around 700 feet above the ground, Captain Anju Khatiora disengaged the autopilot and began flying manually. Before we continue, let's briefly go over some of the ATR 72's flight controls. This is the brake lever. These are the power levers. They control engine power. This is the flap lever, shaped like a flap, which adjusts the wing flaps for added lift. And these are the condition levers. They control fuel flow and manage propeller functions. Setting the condition levers to the feathered position rotates the propeller blades to align with the airflow, minimizing drag. This is only used in the event of an engine failure. Under normal flight conditions, feathering the props results in a major loss of thrust and should never be done in flight. Now back to the story. Captain Kathiora called for flaps 30. Captain Casey acknowledged with flaps 30, but instead of moving the flap lever, he accidentally moved both condition levers to the feathered position. This was followed by a master caution alert. Shockingly, neither pilot noticed the mistake, and the approach continued. They proceeded with the before landing checklist, but failed to detect that the flaps were still not at 30 degrees. One possible reason could be the high workload the pilots were facing. A tight circuit into an unfamiliar airport surrounded by challenging terrain can overwhelm even experienced pilots. As the aircraft turned left toward final approach, Captain Kathiora asked if she should continue the turn. Captain Casey responded, "Continue the turn." She then asked if she should continue the descent. He replied, "It's not needed," and told her to add some power. The flap lever was then set to 30 degrees, though it's unclear who did it. This added drag to an already compromised situation. Shortly after, Captain Kathiora exclaimed there was no power coming from the engines. At this point, she likely realized something was very wrong. Even at this stage, had either pilot checked the condition levers, the accident might have been prevented. ATC cleared the aircraft to land, but the crew did not respond, likely overwhelmed by the situation unfolding in the cockpit. The power levers were then pushed to maximum, but with both engines feathered, this had no effect. It was like putting your car in neutral and flooring the gas pedal. No matter how hard you try, there is no power to move forward. At just 300 feet above ground, the aircraft made a final left turn toward the runway. They were losing altitude rapidly and were getting dangerously close to the ground. Captain Kathiora handed over control to Captain Casey, again calling out that there was no power. The aircraft's stick shaker activated, an urgent warning that the plane was getting very close to stalling. Aircraft stalls if the wings exceed a certain angle of attack, which is indicated by the stall speed. The plane was decelerating and getting close to the stall speed. Seconds later, the aircraft entered an aerodynamic stall, banked sharply to the left, and crashed into the Sethi River Gorge. Tragically, no one on board survived. One of the passengers had been live streaming the flight from his window seat, capturing the final moments as the aircraft suddenly banked left and descended rapidly. The live stream ended abruptly, capturing a chilling glimpse of the tragedy as it unfolded. The investigation found that the lack of published data for Pokhara International Airport may have caused confusion and disorientation in the cockpit. The crew's training for this airport was also deemed inadequate. Additionally, the pilots failed to follow standard operating procedures during the before landing checklist. If Captain Kathiora had visually confirmed flap position after calling for flaps 30, she might have noticed the error, and the crash could have been avoided. In response to the accident, Nepal's Civil Aviation Authority has now prohibited visual approaches to runway 12. Flight 691 is a heartbreaking reminder that even small errors, especially under pressure, can lead to catastrophic outcomes. Improved training, better regulation, and following proper procedures may prevent such tragedies in the future.